Hello, I'm Ariana Barrios, Executive Director of the OC Forum, and I'll be your host for today's special program. Today we will speak with several community leaders about a serious issue affecting our nation and those right here at home: the rise of Asian American Pacific Islander violence and racism. Today's program explores the historical context of racism in our society against the AAPI community, the resiliency of that community, as well as the resources available to those in need of help. Also, what being a good ally means to our friends and neighbors. This issue hits close to home for me personally as well. Just the other day, the news media reported on the latest incident of AAPI hate, and it was right here in my hometown of Orange. I'd like to share that story with you before we get started.
She says she doesn't know what's worse, this stranger threatening to hurt her or that people witnessed it but didn't say anything.
Hey, I'll up. I'll your husband up or your boyfriend or whoever you're talking to on the phone.
28-year-old U.S. Olympic karate athlete Sakura Kokumai was at Grijalva Park in Orange when a stranger started aggressively yelling at her, she says, out of nowhere.
It was just like a normal day. I was just walking to the park, talking to my friend on the phone.
It happened last Thursday at the park where she frequently works out as she prepares for the upcoming Olympics.
He was basically just yelling stuff like, don't talk behind my back. Like, why are you looking at my car? So things like that, it made me notice that it could be something a little bit, I don't know, off. So I kind of let it be.
Don't be looking at me behind my back.
Okay. Obviously, it's scared. I think in the video you can see that I was kind of laughing, but at that moment you really don't know what to do.
At first, she didn't understand why he targeted her. But then, as he got into his car to leave, she heard the racial slurs.
Maybe because it was the way I looked.
You Chinese.
I was aware about the anti-Asian hate that was going on. You see almost every day on the news. But again, I didn't think that it would happen to me at a park that I usually go to train.
Kokumai, who is Japanese American, says there were people around, but most of them ignored it.
One lady did come up towards the end asking if I was okay, but until then as he was kind of walking up yelling, there were people, but they kind of kept it to themselves the entire time. So I thought, okay, like what if this was, my grandma or my mom or anyone in my family, then that scares me.
And that's one of the main reasons she decided to share it publicly.
I do know the responsibility of, having the platform and being an athlete representing the US. So I really thought it was just important to raise awareness.
She told me she's still processing everything, and this incident has not been reported to police. Reporting in Orange, Kimberly Chang, KTLA 5 News.
Incidents like this require us to examine our humanity and our values, to discuss the issues openly and in a productive way, and how we can come together as a community to support those who need our help. After our show, you can navigate to the OC Forum website to share this program, find additional resources, or learn more about our guests and their organizations. Thank you for joining us today. Joining us today is our first guest, and we're so lucky to have her, Dr. Thuy Vo Dang from UCI Archives, and I'm going to let her explain a little bit more about what her specific role is. So, Doctor, thank you for being here, and if you could tell us a little bit more about what you do at UCI.
Thank you so much, Ariana. My name is Thuy Vo Dang, and I am the curator for UCI Library's Southeast Asian Archive, which has been around since 1987. So our archive documents and preserves the history of refugees and immigrants from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And so as our listeners are probably aware, we're in Orange County, which is home to the largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam.
And that particular community, that started many decades ago. That growth happened as a direct result of the Vietnam War, with refugees coming to not just California. I spent time in Texas, very large, vibrant community there, but that's basically when we saw that transition.
That's absolutely right. With the Vietnam-American War ending in 1975, we started to see a major increase in the population of refugees from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, the countries that were entangled in that conflict. So yes, and Camp Pendleton was the first and largest military base that converted to a refugee resettlement camp, which is why we have such a large resettlement population here in Southern California.
And then do you have a particular area of expertise outside of what you just mentioned with the archive itself?
Well, thank you for asking that. Actually, I'm not trained as an archivist. I have a PhD in ethnic studies. So my focus has been on teaching and research on immigration and refugee studies, particularly focused on the Southeast Asian diaspora. I taught for about a decade before I joined UC Irvine, and I've been at UCI for 10 years now.
And I love that you use the word diaspora, because I think that that's an important qualifying remark, that when we think of the AAPI community, it is not one singular group. This is a very large community, a very diverse community. Could you speak a little bit to that?
That is absolutely right. When we say Asian American Pacific Islander, right, it encapsulates so many different cultures, languages, histories. And so even though now after the social movements of the 1960s, where our communities really began to adopt that notion of being part of an Asian American community, we're really very different. We're very diverse and heterogeneous. So, Asian American studies really came out of the effort to try to educate our community about these multiple and nuanced histories. And they're very much a part of, the labor and migration history of the United States, very much part of the history of U.S. global empire, the expansion of the U.S. Through its wars in Asia. So all of these ways that I think our history might tether us to the United States also differentiates us from each other. So you won't meet, too many people, I think, on the street who will say, I'm Asian American necessarily. They'll typically identify as Vietnamese or Vietnamese American, right? Samoan or Samoan American. That would be more typical than actually coming across someone who says, I'm an Asian American.
Well, thank you for that, because I think that that is a really important distinction, and just a way of understanding what we're talking about in this particular issue. For my own part, I didn't realize that when we talk about the AAPI community, that we're also talking about what you just mentioned, Samoan communities, that we're talking about the Pacific Islanders, or even to a large extent, Indian Americans. So it is so diverse in that respect. When you're looking I'm going to start again. When we're looking at the recent rise in what's happening right now in AAPI violence and racism, I think something that's really important to understand, and I'm hoping you can give us some context to this, that it is not necessarily a new phenomenon in our society, in our culture, and I think that that's really important to understand. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. I think when we are thinking about the moment, right, of this COVID-19 pandemic, it feels so new and different for most of us, right? So the increase that we've seen in anti-Asian violence, the information that's circulating in news media and social media might seem rather new to some individuals, but it actually is not new at all in the history of Asian Americans in this country. When President Biden made a statement about how un-American these incidents are, a lot of us who do Asian American studies really wanted to call that out and say, actually, it is not un-American. It's sadly been part of a long history, starting with a very, famous legislative move by the United States government in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Right, this was the first time in U.S. history where a racial group was barred from entering the country. And it was predated by the 1875 Page Act, which attempted to bar Chinese women from coming to this country under the assumption that they would, bring these moral vices. They were prostitutes. They were bringing opium. So very kind of stereotypical views of Chinese people. And so I think we have to kind of situate this moment in a much longer history of Asian exclusion and the violence that has been directed at our communities as a result of policies instituted by our government and people who are in leadership positions who have said things, in recent memory, such as calling COVID-19 the China virus or the Kung flu.
Right.
Right.
And you bring up a really interesting point about the Exclusion Act, which I remember reading about that long ago in my American history, but that it was, I did not realize that it was geared so specifically towards women and Chinese women, which then has a correlation right to today with what we saw in Atlanta. And maybe you could speak about that, because that sexualization of Asian American Pacific Islander women is a huge ongoing problem.
Absolutely. I think we need to really connect the dots between these incidents that are typically associated with racism, right, or xenophobia, with misogyny. I think that what we saw with the Atlanta spa shootings, right, where 6 women were killed out of the 8 by this perpetrator who claimed that he had a sex addiction and who claimed that, he was really trying to he was trying to solve this issue.
Right, exercise his demons, so to speak. Yeah.
Right. It was so problematic in that, I think it really helps us to see this thread that runs through the way in which Asian women in particular have been fetishized. They've been hypersexualized in the imagination of the American people. And this goes back to, like I mentioned, that 1875 Page Act, which was a law that banned Chinese women from coming.
Now, being on the UCI campus, which I believe it's fair to say is probably the largest, college-age student population of AAPI students, what is the feeling on campus? Is there a reaction to this? Are students seeking more services or a better understanding?
We have been in remote or virtual learning now since last March of 2020. But even so, as I've been engaging with cohorts of students in several research projects that I run with other faculty members, what we're sensing is this, I think this climate of anxiety, and there's a lot of worry that our students are carrying within them about their elders, about their family members. Our Asian American students in particular have been doing amazing work in trying to carve out spaces for each other to process what happened in Atlanta and what continues to happen in our communities locally. We've actually seen an uptick in the violence directed towards mainly our Asian American elders. Mm-hmm. I think I read something in the Patch News that Orange County hate crimes against Asian Americans is up 1,200% in the last year.
Goodness gracious.
In
Yeah,
this county.
I believe I read that as well. It's just frightening. And on top of having those fears to be isolated must be very trying for young people.
Yeah,
what type and I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please go ahead.
So for students, what types of resources are available? I'm sure that the campus is very aware and really trying to do everything it can to put resources out to students who aren't on campus to make sure that they can find safety, comfort, and community.
There have been a lot of educational events, on a virtual platform that attempt to help students, place this within this broader history, right? Place the current anti-Asian violence within the broader history for them to be able to understand the much longer trajectory. We also have really amazing staff on our campus who provide culturally competent mentoring and psychological counseling services. So we've tapped those folks quite a bit. And then students often have much more informal networks with each other. So on my part, I advise the Southeast Asian Student Association, and they've been running mentorship programs for the high school youth. So using some of the skills that they've learned at UCI to kind of expand it outwards. So that's been really heartening to see.
And when we look at misunderstandings of the diversity, and I think we have that we have to overcome. And to your point, we have to know our history. But there are so many people like myself, people connected to the forum, who really want to understand and how to be a good ally. Could you speak a little bit to that on what it means to be a good ally?
Thank you for that question. I think right now we see the urgency of having allies stand up, right? Be upstanders rather than passive bystanders. So I think on the one hand, it is about individuals in our community feeling a sense of collective responsibility, and wherever they might witness an incident of hate towards their neighbors, to please speak up and report it. A lot of times our elders, especially when they do not speak English, there's a lot of fear of the authorities and a lack of access to avenues for reporting. So they can do some of that work in assisting our community members to report these incidents so that they're documented so we can address them. And also intervene when it's safe, right? I think you already mentioned before, like, I think there is a deep need for us to learn more. To commit to learning this history that I mentioned. And I think it's really important to actually learn the history as it kind of plays out in a local context. So I want to just share a story about an incident that really emphasizes how we really need to know the history of anti-Asian violence, but we also need to know the history of resistance and resilience from our communities. So in 1996, Thiên Minh Ly, who was a Vietnamese American youth, he was 24 years old, a graduate of UCLA and Georgetown. He was rollerblading in the tennis courts at Tustin High School, close to his parents' home. And he was brutally murdered by two white supremacists. Right? This was a terrible act of hate and violence that shook our communities. Initially, the district attorney did not want to prosecute Gunnar Lindbergh, the white supremacist who murdered Thiên Minh Ly, did not want to prosecute it as a hate crime until the Thiên Minh Ly's family, along with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, at the time they were known as the Asian Pacific American Legal Center.
Yes.
They advocated, the Vietnamese American community mobilized, they took to the streets in protest, they really pushed for a hate crime conviction. And it turned out that Lindbergh ended up being sent, he was the first person from Orange County convicted and sent on a hate crime charge to San Quentin for with the death penalty. So that was very significant, but I really want to emphasize how the community came together and mobilized, just as we did for the Vincent Chin example, right, which was a national incident. This one happened in our backyard. This happened in Tustin in 1996. That wasn't too long ago.
No.
And students, organized candlelight vigils. There were opportunities to learn and educate ourselves about the history. And I think that this moment calls for us to do the same.
I 100% agree with you. I want to leave on, we have some things coming up. There are obviously, where would you point someone to look for either ways to get involved directly or, there are a lot of, I believe next month is AAPI Heritage Month. So it's in this time of sadness and fear, we're also looking ahead to something where we can celebrate together. Where would you point people who want to get more involved and who want to participate?
So I would be remiss if I didn't point out some of our resources. Right? UC Irvine offers a plethora of events. If you look on the UCI Humanities Center website, for example, you'll see such a great offering of workshops, programs, learning opportunities for the month of May. I would also say if you can and are able to donate to social justice organizations that are really working on the front lines to stop Asian hate and to build coalitions, please do so. The very well-known Stop AAPI Hate is one organization. And then I mentioned Asian Americans Advancing Justice. They have an office in Orange County. And just get involved, volunteer, talk, if you're a parent, talk to your children so that they are aware of what's going on. this is a form of bullying that's scaled way up, right? So I think it really does start at the level of K through 12 education.
And we're going to have a superintendent from one of the school districts, the local Orange County School District, speaks specifically to that, because I think you're absolutely right. That is a very important, segment of the population that we need to reach now to help them understand. Well, Doctor, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really enlightening. This was great information and important historical context that I think we needed to hear. So I know you're a very busy lady, but thank you so much for joining us today.
The future of healthcare is here. With approval to build UCI Medical Center Irvine Newport, UCI Health will bring the unparalleled expertise and quality care of Orange County's only academic health system to coastal and South County residents. Our state-of-the-art acute care hospital, alongside 2 outpatient care centers, will offer a 24-hour emergency room, urgent care services, easier access to leading-edge cancer treatments, and clinical trials from our NCI designated Comprehensive Cancer Center, and exceptional inpatient and outpatient care by our world-renowned experts in every discipline, from digestive disease to neurosciences and orthopedic surgery and cancer care. At UCI Health, we will stop at nothing to build a healthier Orange County.
Well, welcome back. And our next guest today is a member of the City Council in the city of Irvine. And I am greatly appreciative that he could join us today. Councilmember Anthony Kuo from the city of Irvine. Welcome to our show.
Hi, Ariana. I'm so happy to be with my friends here at the Orange County Forum.
So your role, obviously, most of us know what a council member does, but can you talk a little bit about your role in the city and more specifically about Irvine itself?
Sure. So one of the things that I'm most proud of is that I am the first member of the City Council to have grown up in Irvine. We're a little bit newer of a city, being kind of the bridge between Central Orange County and South Orange County. But my parents moved here in 1978. I would love to say I was born in Irvine, but we didn't have a hospital here back then. I was born in Hogue down the street in Newport Beach, and now we're so grateful to be home to 2 hospitals and soon to be 3 with the development of City of Hope coming to Irvine. I was elected in 2018, just a couple of years ago. And before that, I served about 8 years on our city's planning commission. And even before that, I started at City Hall when I was in high school as an intern. So my history with not just City Hall goes a long, long way back.
Now, Irvine in particular, like you mentioned that it's a newer city in Orange County, but it is certainly home to one of the largest, if not the largest, AAPI communities in all of Orange County. But within that, it's extremely diverse. Can you speak a little bit to that and the makeup of Irvine?
So about 40% of our population is Asian, and that doesn't include other ethnic minorities who aren't Asian. But that wasn't always the case. So I always tell folks that when I grew up in Irvine, there was maybe me plus 2 or 3 other kids in the class who were Asian. And as a council member going to visit some of these schools, you walk in and there's maybe 3 kids in the class who aren't Asian. So that genesis has evolved, I would say, starting in the late 80s and early 90s. My recollection is that it actually started when 99 Ranch Market and Daiho Chinese Market came to town, and Asians started moving to Irvine because they could find the groceries they need.
Now, obviously, we all want our communities to be peaceful, but nationwide, we're seeing these incidences of AAPI violence, and now we're starting to see them, and they're being reported right here at home. How is the city of Irvine addressing those issues with such a large and vulnerable community to protect?
So one of the things that I take great pride in on behalf of our staff at City Hall, some of it's council driven and some of it is staff driven, is that we talk about things and we go around the table and we come up with good ideas, but then we do something really novel. We take action on it. So we started years ago, as an example, with our police department, doing what is typically done, town hall meetings, going around to different neighborhoods, talking about, neighborhood watch to dare to different programs that we have. But what our police department does is they actually go out into the community and do these programs in people's native languages. I've had the pleasure of attending, at least for the last 3, our annual Mandarin speaking public safety town hall, where our chief comes out, many members of our city council come out, and we even bring some of our Chinese speaking officers. And, I grew up speaking English in my household. My parents spoke English to me, and we went back and forth. But there really is something about that comfort level of participating in an exercise like that in your native language. And the story that comes to mind was sitting there, and Don Wagner was our mayor at the time, and people were asking questions, and somebody asked something, and everybody started laughing, including myself. And Don leaned over and he said, "What was the question?" And the question actually was, and pardon the translation, but it really was said very casually. It was, "So, can I spank my kid or not?" I don't think that question would come up in a public safety town hall in English, and certainly not a public safety town hall in English with folks where English wasn't their first language. And so it started back then. This year, with all that's been going on, our council has actually even gone a step beyond that. We now have hate crime and hate incident reporting on our website. It should be live any day now, but we also put it up in different languages. We are pushing it out to different communities. The thing is, with a lot of folks from ethnic minority communities, feel uncomfortable reaching out to government. They feel uncomfortable reporting things to the police. If you look at unrest throughout the world, sometimes the police aren't the most trusted folks. And in fact, in our own country, sometimes certain communities don't feel that they can trust the police 100%. In Irvine, our police cars, and I talk about this a lot, our chief of police talks about this a lot, our police cars have emblazoned on the side in partnership with the community. I'm very, very proud of our Irvine police officers and other public safety personnel who really go above and beyond, not to just be law enforcement, to be an integral part of the community's fabric. So we have a long history of saying what we need to say, but putting things into action too, to bring comfort and bring support, and certainly offer service to all communities.
Well, and we talked about that with some of our other guests in terms of, that complete, not only diversity of cultures, but diversity of experiences in terms of the levels one may or may not have experienced prejudice or racism. But in Irvine, where you have such a diverse community, and it's changed so much just over the last few decades, what does it look like to be an ally, to stand with, the communities that need our support? In your mind, what does that look like?
I think it means reaching out. And that's kind of what I talked about earlier, where our police department reaches out. But I think it kind of goes both ways too. So my grandfather was a member and was a leader. He was on the board of directors of a local organization called the Irvine Evergreen Chinese Senior Association. Say that 10 times fast. But they would raise money every year through little programs or luncheons that they would have. And once a year, whatever they had left, they would donate back to the senior center. And so when you walk into Lakeview Senior Center in Irvine today, on the plaque of donors, you will see Irvine Chinese Evergreen Senior Association on the wall. I see different groups popping up all over town, and I'm sure other communities have this as well, where it's the, such and such high school Korean Parents Association or the Indian Parents Association. And I think that when you come from another country, uh, service and giving back is really something that is, no pun intended, kind of foreign. I think community service is really a uniquely American thing, where people go out and plant trees and go out and do work and to make their community better and don't get paid for it. And if we can have more of that through these ethnic groups or through these traditional groups and more interaction between the two, I think that to me is what it means to be an ally. I mean, I will go not on a ethnicity based thing. I'll go and volunteer with churches that I don't go to. I will go and attend festivals that I don't necessarily know the culture, but I want to learn a little bit more. Here in Irvine, we produce an annual event called Global Village, and it is a fantastic multicultural festival. We didn't do it last year because of COVID, but one of my, for lack of a better term, criticisms of that event is that we have different booths and different sections. And I know in Orange, you've got the International Street Fair as well, but we've got different booths. And one of the things I've said is we need to have more interaction, because what you find is among the Korean booths, most of the people visiting the Korean booths are Korean. Among the Turkish booths, most of the folks visiting the Turkish booths are Turkish. So it's wonderful to celebrate your own culture. It's even cooler to learn about someone else's culture and find something that's interesting about them. There was and I'm not Lutheran, but there was a Lutheran bishop who passed away. His name is Krister Stendal. And Bishop Stendal said something about interfaith discussions, which I think can apply to all discussions. But one of his rules was to have holy envy. And what holy envy is to look at someone else's faith and say, you know what, I don't believe that in my faith, but I think that's really neat. And I wish we could practice that with people's faith, with people's ethnicity, where you can look at someone's ethnicity and say, you know, that's not a tradition that I grew up with, but I really think that tradition's neat. I really admire that tradition. And so if we could all, it's easier said than done, but have open minds about that, I think that our communities would be a much, much better place.
Right. The heritage, language, culture, that's going to play a big part in people's comfort levels. Does it change the way how you look at policy? And I'll be real specific. You mentioned, and I loved what you talked about, the town halls and policing, community involvement with your police department. Does it change how you look at strategies within, say, the police department of how do we tackle diversity so that we have more people, that we're looking for these things where we're looking for officers who can help, match our community? Does it change the way you look at those things?
You know, there's a funny movie line where it says, no politician ever admits to not knowing something unless they're being indicted. I'm not being indicted, but I would be the first person to say, I don't know everything. When it comes to public safety, COVID aside, I regularly go on probably 3 to 4 police ride-alongs a year. Mm-hmm. Why? To fully understand what our officers are going through. And I meet with, parents of thespians, parents of athletes, parents of, kids who just want to get 10 more points on the SAT. And to hear their stories and to hear their perspectives for me is extremely helpful. One of the other measures that we've taken in Irvine is the creation of a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. Now, I'll be honest, I had a little bit of reservation about that kind of committee, and I heard a lot of feedback from the community about it. But ultimately, I supported it because I think that group, and each council member has an appointee, but I think that group could come back with some very, very good recommendations. Now, they could come back with some recommendations that I might think goes too far, but we have to explore that conversation. I know we're talking about, Asian Americans today, but it reminds me very much of a situation I dealt with last fall, and why I was very sympathetic to what was going on with all the unrest in the spring. So last fall of 2019, I was at a pizza party. You could gather back then with the football team and cheerleaders of Northwood High School. They had just played a game, and I said, I'm going to throw you guys a pizza party for one of your games. And I was talking to one of the parents, and she's African American. And she said to me, she goes, we bought my 16-year-old son a car. And do you know what it's like for him to drive through Irvine in a 20-year-old car after a football game on Friday, after the pizza party at 11:30? And at that point I said, I have never known what that's like, but now that you're sharing with me, I have a fraction of the awareness of what that is. And so my counsel to everybody, particularly public officials, is get out of your circle. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but we have a lot of politicians who surround themselves with people who say, yes, that's a good idea. I'm so glad you came up with it. Go and talk to people who don't look like you. Go and talk to people who aren't from your neighborhood, because you're going to hear that they have a perspective that you would have never thought of. And I think that is vitally important, to be able to get out there, get out of City Hall and get out and talk to people, whether it's a police ride along or talking to parents, and you'll learn a whole heck of a lot.
Well, I could not agree with you more, and that is really great advice. And we're out of time for this segment, but I'm so grateful you were able to come and join us today, and I hope it's the first of many visits we get to have.
Thank you. I'm such a fan of you and the Orange County Forum, and I want to thank everybody who's been participating throughout the last year on these online forums. It's certainly not getting together for lunch, but it comes as a close second.
Well, it sounds like we'll be able to get together soon, so we have a lot more conversations to come. Thank you, Council Member, and I hope to see you soon.
Great. Have a great one.
My next guest, and I'm really excited to welcome him to his first appearance on the OC Forum, is Superintendent Matsuda of the Anaheim Union High School District in Anaheim, California. So Superintendent Matsuda, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ariana, and thank you to the folks at the OC Forum.
So obviously I just said that your district's in Anaheim, but Anaheim Union High School District is actually much bigger than Anaheim. Could we start a little bit by talking about all the communities that your district encompasses?
Yes, we encompass 5 cities. That would be Anaheim, Buena Park, Stanton, Cypress, and La Palma. Just under 30,000 students, close to 50 languages spoken, a lot of first-generation immigrant families, a lot of poverty here, and then we have kind of east side, west side dynamics as well in terms of social economics.
Now, with that size of a student population, I would imagine that makes you one of the largest school districts in the county.
Yes, we're a 7 through 12 district, and if we were K-12, we would be the largest, close to 60,000, but half of that is just under 30,000.
And you mentioned all the different cities that the district covers and all the different languages. I think you said 50 languages in the district. What does that mean in terms of cultures and the diversity of your district?
Thank you for that question. It's a very complex culture and multicultures. So you do have a lot of interethnic and intra-ethnic tension, especially when we're entering a recession, especially during this pandemic time. I think there's a real challenge for institutions to build trust in public schools and in government and business. And I think this is a very, very pivotal time for this country, especially in terms of how our communities view our institutions.
We talked to, just before you joined us, we talked to Dr. Vodang from UCI. And one of the things I asked her, and maybe you can shed even more light on this, is the diversity within the AAPI community. I think that there is maybe a misunderstanding, or certainly just not a full, complete picture of how diverse that community is. Could you speak a little bit to that?
That's a great question, Ariana, because unlike the Hispanic Latino community, where it's primarily Spanish and primarily one religion, although there's a lot of, and it's primarily Catholic, right, and some Protestant, and some diversity. Certainly there's a lot of diversity in the Hispanic community as far as the different sort of countries of origin. But with the Asian Pacific population, there are multiple languages and multiple religions as well. And the other piece too is the generational divide. I think it's pretty distinct with many of our API communities.
And when you address that in your school district, and I'm sure this affects you personally as well, that when we're talking about what's going on right now in the country, and even right here at home, this rise in violence of overt racism, how does that translate in terms of what your students are seeing or what you're seeing on campus?
Yeah, this is a very serious problem for us because of this has been a constant narrative, I think, in becoming American for people of color and immigrants especially. My parents were interned, they were American citizens. My mom was a freshman on December 7th, 1941.
Oh my.
At Anaheim High School, right? So, and she and her family were sent off to internment camps despite being a citizen. So I think the challenge for America has always been this tension between what the founders and the aspirational goals of the Declaration and the Constitution and what the reality is. And I think once again we're experiencing that, right? Because of the emphasis and the objectification and scapegoating on minorities, Latinos as well as Asians, and obviously African Americans in our Black community.
Now, you bring up a really good convergence point in your own personal story. And for my personal story, being connected to the Mendez lawsuit that ended school segregation, one of the pivotal stories within that whole historic moment was that for the Mendez family, they moved into this area to take over a farm of a Japanese family who had been put into an internment camp. And then that jettison them into this, oh my goodness, there are segregated schools. So you have two enormous racial issues at that moment happening. And I think people don't even realize, that this history is a long-standing history that, both of our communities have dealt with.
I think this is why I think one of the longer-term solutions or responses to a lot of this is ensuring that ethnic studies and these historic American, the story of all Americans is included in our schools, because that's the last place where they learn about issues like Mendez v. Westminster. And, the other part of this too is there's inter-ethnic tension and prejudices again between Latinos and Asians and African Americans and whites. So it's really important that Asians understand that their, quote, some of their success is due to sacrifices like the Mendez v. Westminster, like the Brown v. Board of Education. So our paths are all interconnected.
Now, for your school district, my understanding is that your students are still distance learning at the moment. So how do you see a reaction in terms of students needing help or struggling with these issues, or families struggling with these issues? How do you offer resources through the school district so that in this time of isolation they aren't alone, or that there is something for them to grab onto and get the help and support they need?
Well, obviously, you need a lot of the social workers and a good mental health program that is very cognizant of the language and cultural competency needs, right, of our professionals. So we've done a lot of work in terms of ensuring there's layers of sort of a safety net to identify students and families in distress and trying to get them the right level of services. But I think the other thing too that we've done with some of our stimulus monies is to hire high school. We have a very strong internship and mentoring program, so we're able to convert into hiring high school students to mentor those more isolated, and especially the younger ones, the junior high kids too. So we hired about 500 high school youth and another 300 or 400 college students that are working in small groups with students that are more isolated. And I think that many of the school us in Santa Ana, I think the only ones that are still in distance learning. And but at the same time, we are opening up smaller learning pods, live face-to-face learning pods. So it's been a very complex navigation because there are pockets of Orange County where the spread was very acute, and in Anaheim, Anaheim alone has lost more than 800 people. And so these stories of trauma and loss are rippling throughout our communities and really exacerbating the levels of anxiety and depression with young people.
So what does that look like in terms of a student or a family who needs help? And I think you bring up a great point. We're still going through this global pandemic, and now on top of that, you have a certain community being targeted or blamed by some of the rhetoric that's being used for that pandemic. What can students and families look for in terms of support? What resources are available for them on top of what you've mentioned for the district?
Well, I think it's important the partnerships with nonprofits who specialize in supporting communities of color. In Orange County, it's Orange County Asian and Pacific Islander Community Alliance, OCAPICA. They have the Korean groups as well, and Latino Health Access. Those are really important and vital partners in these times of trauma because they have trust with the communities. They have cultural competence with the community. So those are really, really important right now. And I think that funding and resources need to go to those nonprofits that can partner with schools and provide more enhanced direct services to these families.
And then one of the questions I asked our last guest, and I will ask all of our guests, is what are your own personal experiences? Have you been the victim yourself of racism such as this that we're seeing right now? Maybe not directly related to obviously the global pandemic, but you mentioned your mom, and I'm interested to know, if you don't mind my asking, what have your experiences been?
Well, pretty bad growing up in Orange County during the Vietnam War, where the Vietnamese and Asians were objectified as the enemy. So even though I was, again, American citizen, not able to speak Japanese, so that was a lot kind of, a lost language. My parents did not want to be identified. But physically, right, you can't get away from that. So when I grew up during the Vietnam War, I was teased and chink and all those horrible names. So I did have, I think, real challenges in terms of my own shame and self-esteem. And I think there were, I have all kinds of stories. I mean, dating my first white girlfriend in high school, going to Knott's Berry Farm and being chased out of Knott's Berry Farm by some white boys and really running for our lives. So it's very real. And fast forward to now, there are a lot of young kids, Asian kids, who are very afraid. Their parents are afraid. And we know that Asian Pacific hate crimes have grown by tenfold in the last year in Orange County. We also know that many of the most vulnerable, the senior citizens, because many of them speak with an accent, are targeted We also know that Asian women are targeted too, and young women as well. So there's a lot of layers of fear with many of our kids. And so that's why I think we need to respond with love and compassion and higher awareness of this. I think it's a mistake just to focus on, quote, learning loss and try to catch these kids up. I think we need to approach learning loss with more sense of resiliency, building resiliency and recovery and hope and optimism, and really emphasize the compassion that these and the love that all kids need, but especially those that feel most targeted right now.
Well, and you bring up a really good point about resiliency and hope. So in that spirit, for those who are looking to really understand what it means to be a good ally, what it means to be, you know, standing shoulder to shoulder with the AAPI community, what does that look like for you? What would you recommend to somebody who's asking those questions?
Well, you know, you go back to the Mendez story, right? When Mr. Mendez went to lease the farm from the Minamutsu family who were in the internment camp, there was something between these two men when they looked eye to eye and shook hands. There was something about trust, about a sense of compassion and understanding. And I think that's what we need right now in terms of our ordinary interactions with our neighbors, with people who are strangers to us, in terms of how we treat them and how we have eye contact and smile. People don't do that intentionally enough. I've encouraged our young people and our principals too, and our adults to challenge yourself to look at a homeless person in the eye and just give a smile, just to acknowledge that person. Because oftentimes we don't want to even look at the person in the eye because they're invisible. It's best, because as soon as we acknowledge that person, then somehow the relationship is on us. And I think we have to embrace that. So
the humanity of it, if nothing else.
Yeah, people think there's nothing we can do. There's all these big problems out there. Yet, yes, each one of us can do something every day. And all those little things, like RFK said so many years ago, a little ripple of hope, it spreads out and it multiplies. And I think that's the positive message here. And our kids are so responsive to that message.
And just to end our conversation, and I so thank you for being here. Do you live in hope, Superintendent?
I do. I think educators, healthcare workers, we live in hope. We live in hope and love, and that's why we chose this profession. And I am so proud to be part of public education and education right now, because we are in good hands. I can tell you that, Ariana. And I'm so thankful for this opportunity to share some of our stories.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know you have your hands full with all the kids that you oversee, and I know they are very lucky to have you, sir. So with that, I just want to thank you again for joining us today, and I hope that this will not be the last time that you're a guest on our program.
Thank you, Ariana.
In honor of our 30th anniversary celebration of the OC Forum, we are raising $30,000 to establish an endowment fund. Our 30 for 30 fundraising campaign is looking for 30 generous sponsors to donate or pledge $1,000 to this fund. If you wish to contribute, please visit the link in the description below this video. I would also like to thank you for your continued support. These programs would simply not be possible without your contribution. Now please enjoy the rest of the show.
Our next guest on today's program, and I'm very grateful she could join us, is Connie Chung Joe, and she is with the, and I'm going to make sure that I get this right, the Asian Americans Advancing Justice for Los Angeles and Orange County. So that's a mouthful, and thank you for being here. I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about your role and particularly about your organization and what you do.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm the CEO of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and we are the nation's largest civil rights and legal services organization for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. So Advancing Justice has LA and Orange County offices. We're headquartered in LA, but we do serve the area of Southern California, which includes LA and OC. I am the organization's CEO. I joined in August of last year in the midst of the pandemic, really because of what we were seeing with the escalation in hate towards the Asian American community as we were scapegoated for COVID-19. And it really, for me, made me want to go back to my original legal roots as a civil rights attorney and work on social justice.
Well, and I have to believe that while we're seeing the news media pick up these stories, you bring up a good point. This didn't just start in the last couple of months. You know, the rhetoric that's been going on for the past year with the pandemic has been going on for quite a while.
Yeah, absolutely. We started to see the escalation of hate against the Asian American community early part of 2020. Even before the lockdown happened, there were Asian Americans being attacked. There was a high school boy in the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles who was beaten by other students, and he ended up going to the hospital. That happened all before we even went on lockdown. So, and in the beginning, first couple months of the pandemic, the violence was pretty bad. We had someone who had acid thrown on her face in New York City, a man and his children who were stabbed at a Sam's Club in Texas. But then what we saw was that as the months went by, it got a little bit quieter or a little bit less. And then unfortunately, we've seen the violence really pick up, both in terms of quantity and the severity in the last couple months.
And while I don't want you necessarily to speculate, I have to imagine that, you know, your group and the other groups that you connect with and have that, you know, that everybody is talking about this. Do you have an idea of why, you know, right now we seem to see this escalation, which is just really terrifying?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things that we're thinking about. One is when we first started to see the uptick earlier on in 2021, one thing we noticed was that was around the time of Lunar New Year or Chinese New Year. And it is a general pattern, actually, that around Lunar New Year every year, there does tend to be a little bit more violence against the Asian American community. Sometimes businesses in Chinatowns are vandalized. That, unfortunately, with the positive attention that comes with that holiday, sometimes the negative attention does as well. So you have that with what is already an underlying higher rate of violence against our community during this whole pandemic as we've been scapegoated. And then I think on top of that, you had folks that were upset about the presidential elections. And I think we saw violence with the insurrection in the Capitol earlier on. And I think there was some resentment there. And I think that can also have some contributing part to this. And then I think what we're also seeing now is, unfortunately, there is some copycatters where, you know, there's a phenomenon as people hear more about it or see it, such as the attacking of Asian seniors, that other people have picked up on that and continue to do that. So it's a variety of factors. As you said, we don't know exactly what it is, but those are some of the things that we believe contributed to what's been the most recent rise in hate in the last couple months.
And with some of our other guests who've been on previously today, we've talked about within the AAPI community a reluctance to report. And as a civil rights organization, your whole the whole basis of your mission is to help people report and to help people win their rights. What does that look like in terms of giving people the resources and the voice that they need?
Yeah. No, we absolutely see a problem of underreporting. We know that there's been about 4,000 reported incidents so far, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg. So many more incidents are happening that are not being reported on. And we know there's a few reasons for that. There's sometimes language barriers where people don't feel comfortable speaking or going to a mainstream organization. There are cultural barriers where people don't frankly know where to go or why would they do it if they're not used to the laws of this country and how hate crimes are enforced. There is some cultural barriers in terms of some Eastern cultures that also say, when something unpleasant happens, we just let it lie. We don't talk about it. We don't air our dirty laundry. And so that also, I think, quiets our voice sometimes. And then we know, for example, women who have been victimized twice, at least twice as much as Asian men during this pandemic. And certainly the Atlanta shootings where we saw 6 Asian women who were killed. That for women face additional barriers as well, because for them, there is often a shame or stigma or embarrassment when they are attacked, that they somehow feel embarrassed or guilty themselves. And then finally, there's a fear of not being believed and then having what has already been a traumatic event and then having a secondary trauma of people adding insult to injury by saying, I think you're making this up, or I don't believe you. And that, unfortunately, we've seen as well. So yes, we are seeing all of these barriers that get in the way for people reporting. At Advancing Justice, we are really trying to encourage people that they need to come out and report it, whether they go to the police, whether that's by contacting our helplines, where we have multilingual helplines in 6 different Asian languages, whether it's an online reporting site such as Stop AAPI Hate. When we report it, no matter how large or small the incident, it adds to the volume and the numbers. And it is that wake-up call to our larger American society that this is truly a problem. This is not an isolated incident. It is really something that is a huge phenomenon that is happening in our community. So we are most definitely trying to promote people knowing what we're doing. So we have advertisements we're going to be putting out in multiple Asian ethnic media to let them know this is our helpline number, that we can provide victim services, we can provide legal services, and really just trying to get the word out.
Well, and one of the things that, well, first of all, let me ask you this. What is the best tactic that you have found that helps people get over that fear of reporting or even just asking for help? Is there a particular argument that we can all use as a community to help give our friends and neighbors a sense of comfort and that this is the right thing to do that will move everybody forward?
Yeah. So for us, some of the tactics to get people to overcome that barrier that's preventing them from asking for help is, we are trying to eliminate as many barriers as we can. That's why we do things in our multilingual helpline, because when people have to speak in a language that's not their original or their native tongue, it's harder. It's harder to express yourself, and it's hard to talk about something that's really emotionally might be very challenging. So it's removing those kinds of linguistic and cultural barriers. We are also trying to encourage groups like law enforcement to connect with Asian community-based organizations that work already with victims and with the community. So a lot of our community members will feel inherently more comfortable talking to an Asian Pacific Islander organization that they know about, they've heard about, is trusted in the community. So we have been working to try to get law enforcement, if a victim comes to them, and let's say it doesn't rise to the level of a hate crime, but it's an incident that maybe somebody got spat on or called a racial slur. So in that kind of situation, the police are their hands are tied. They're not going to be able to arrest anyone. And we know actually 90 to 95 of the incidents are those types of incidents that aren't criminal. But what they could do is still give the victim information about, hey, there's a Chinese organization that provides counseling, or there's a Korean organization where you can get health services, and help give the victim support in a way that is going to be comfortable for them. So trying to figure out things like that.
Just connecting those dots from where they might initially think they should report and where they should may actually need to report. To your point, the volume. And I think the latest stat for at least Orange County is it's gone up 100-fold in terms of incidents in the last year, which is an astonishing number. And my last question for you is about being a good ally. I think all of us were shocked and sickened to see some of the video that has come out, particularly from New York, where it was so blatantly obvious that people were not only just standing by, they were actively standing back, away from a victim in the midst of a crisis situation. So that's relatively easy to say, not that. Don't do that ever. That's just being a bad human being. But as an ally, a day-to-day, shoulder-to-shoulder ally, what does that look like to you, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, and that was so heartbreaking to watch that happen. So we are encouraging people to take bystander intervention training. And that is how you can learn how to safely help to de-escalate a situation before it goes out of control. So we are offering them through our office at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and you could go to our website, which is advancingjustice-la.org. And we are starting them in the next couple of weeks here. And what you learn in those trainings, which were developed through a curriculum by an organization called Hollaback, is they call them the 5 Ds. The 5 Ds are distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct. And so, for example, distract means if you hear somebody harassing, let's say, an Asian person on the train, how can you find a way to indirectly distract and break that moment? So maybe you drop your cup of coffee right there in front of them, and all of a sudden everyone's looking at it. Or you go up and you ask the person, hey, do you know what time it is? You do things to indirectly break the moment, and that can help de-escalate. Things like direct means find somebody who is in a position of authority who can help in the situation. If you're on the bus and something's happening, you could go up to the bus driver and say, hey, can you pull over? There's something happening back here right now. Or speak to the manager at a restaurant or retailer where you see the harassment happening. Document means be aware of what's happening, whether it is capturing it by camera or knowing what time and where and the details. So that way, if a police report does need to be made, you can be a witness and provide some of those details. Delay means that after the incidents happen, go up to the victim, provide some sort of support to them. And finally, direct is to say very clearly, this is not appropriate, and make that kind of statement if you can do it in a safe manner.
Well, this is the perfect way to end, because those are all great tactics, and I'm glad that I was here to hear them. And I think I'll probably be one of the first people to sign up for your classes when those become available. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and joining us and sharing all this. We will be sharing it on our website as well as part of the program. So thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
We've reached the end of this important discussion, and I hope you have found the information valuable. For information about this special presentation, our upcoming programs, please visit our website at www.ocforum.org. On behalf of the OC Forum Board of Directors, our sponsors, and all of our guests who took time to be with us today, thank you for joining the conversation.